The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN's The Durian Heat. Today we have a guest, Sern. He is a graduate of Masters of Philosophy in Comparative Social Policy, University of Oxford. He is an expert in terms of the Orang Asli's healthcare policy, and today he's going to speak on that particular topic and also with a comparison with the Aboriginal Australians. So the Orang Asli's healthcare policy is getting better or worse? We have Sern here to give the answer. Hi.
Hi Arlene. How are you?
So yeah, currently you're based in Malaysia, right? Currently.
Yeah. So I've been back for a couple of months now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how long you did the research on this Orang Asli healthcare?
So sorry, how did I do the research?
How you stumbled upon the topic and how long you did the research?
Okay, so the research was carried out over the period of a year, actually 2 years during my master's. So I did field work in both Malaysia and Australia, and so yes, talked to a lot of like prominent scholars and also with activists out there, and did a lot of archival research since my research is quite historical. So comparing the historical development both of healthcare in both countries. In terms of how I stumbled upon this topic, it began with my interest for the past few years in the Orang Asli issues. I've been involved with the Center for Orang Asli Concerns. I've also done some organizing work with the Orang Asli here, and also with indigenous communities in Ecuador, where I was there for half a year working with Fundación, a Latin American nonprofit.
So how different is the Orang Asli in the Peninsula Malaysia in comparison with the ones in Sabah and Sarawak?
So when we talk about Orang Asli, we mean specifically the indigenous population of Peninsula Malaysia. Orang Asal is the broader term that includes both the indigenous people of Sabah Sarawak and the ones in Peninsula. So the kind of issues they face are very different, because on the one hand, in the Peninsula you have a specific department that's devoted towards the quote-unquote welfare of the Orang Asli, while in Sabah Sarawak it's not as centralized. You have different community organizations that do things. You also have the state government, but they're treated quite differently. And historically speaking as well, with the advent of the emergency period in the 50s up until the early 60s, the Orang Asli have a very special relationship with the administration, and yeah, that's how at least like the whole relationship between the government and Orang Asli started.
Mm-hmm. So previously the Orang Asli don't really have a formalized contact with the Malaysian government or the colonial government.
So yes, so with the colonial government there wasn't much contact, but there was contact with the sultanates, so in the different states.
Mm-hmm. What kind of relationship in the past they have? Were they very much in touch with in terms of access towards welfare or any kind of engagement?
Okay, so in the past,
especially when it comes to healthcare, the issue.
Right. So healthcare wasn't something that was very central in the past. So before the 1948, so pre-World War II or Japanese occupation, the Orang Asli were pretty much seen as just like jungle forest dwellers, and the only kind of healthcare they got was from either missionaries or from some bureaucrats out there who wanted to provide some extra services as they were doing things. So these are, when I talk about bureaucrats here, in the 40s and 50s, I mean like foreign British bureaucrats at that time.
There's no such thing as hospital clinics, mobile clinics?
Not before the emergency period, yeah.
So traditionally, how the Orang Asli would attend to their health? Do they have any either specific focus on healthcare?
So I would say I'm not an expert completely in Orang Asli traditional healthcare, but typically, so they have their own healing practices, and the bomoh in the village is the one that really carries out the different rituals and the different gives out medication to people. So and the way they view health is very holistic. It's not the way that people in Western medicine view diseases, where it's very focused on specific ailments and illnesses that you treat. So with the Orang Asli, it's much more about treating the person as a whole.
And it's also about the lifestyles, yeah?
Yeah, so it's a lifestyle, and also your relationship with nature, with the environment. So it's a very all-encompassing way of looking at things.
So how has the Orang Asli healthcare policy developed or evolved since the emergency period?
Okay, so during the emergency period was when the healthcare system started, and back then this started because the British wanted to win the Orang Asli over from the Malayan communists. So
it was a political move in a way.
It was very much motivated by issues of domestic security, first of all, and second, because there was a national health imperative. So the Orang Asli was seen as potential reservoirs of disease. This is to quote a 1959 report by the Department of Orang Asli Affairs.
And how it evolved into something that is more complex now. Who was the founder, and what happened in the past where they tried to create this healthcare policy towards the Orang Asli? Sorry,
are you asking about the more current area?
Since the emergency period,
Okay, so since the emergency period, so towards the end of the emergency period, a British doctor came into play. So there were two medical officers that were officially hired during that time in 1955. One was Hans Lichtenstein, and the other one was John Malcolm Bolton. Lichtenstein was here for a couple of years, but Bolton stayed from 1955 to 72, and essentially he had full control of the development of this healthcare system for Orang Asli, and the certain things that he did were to introduce, so he expanded the service quite a lot, which included the development of Gombak Hospital. There was also what do you call it, there was a flying doctor service, so they would send
flying doctors.
Yeah, they call it the flying doctor service. So I
would love to have a flying doctor service.
so they have helicopters that would pick them up and send them into the interiors of the country to reach the populations of Orang Asli out there.
What year was that?
So this started in actually 1955, around 54. This already started. So even before Bolton was here. But when Bolton was here, so some things that he did that were really quite revolutionary, even for that time in global history, was to really involve the Orang Asli in healthcare. So he did this in several ways. One thing was to hire the Orang Asli as medical orderlies. So he trained the Orang Asli. So a lot of the staff members at the hospital or in the healthcare service in general back then were all Orang Asli people. He didn't care if they didn't have the right education background. The idea was to how can we bridge the needs of the Orang Asli with the advancements of.
So he was trying to empower the Orang Asli themselves into getting familiar with the healthcare system of the colonial era.
So he was trying to marry both traditions of medicine, because he saw that the Orang Asli were suffering from a lot of diseases that had been introduced in the past few decades, actually few hundred years, because of outside influences, so interaction with either European powers or with the different Malay kingdoms back then. So that introduced a lot of diseases, and they were falling sick, and there was a need to address this, and some traditional practices were maybe just not enough to address this. So he wanted to make Western medicine, quote-unquote Western medicine, accessible to the Orang Asli, and he did this with medical orderlies. And the more interesting one was with what he called Bomoh conventions. So he held a lot of quote-unquote conferences that were meant to allow Bomohs or witch doctors from Orang Asli villages to come out
and learn modern medicine.
Or not so much learn modern medicine, but to share what they know, and also to just to give them some basic medication that they can use.
That's pretty interesting, because nowadays when you talk about Bomoh, immediately you will think about the Raja Bomoh from the MH370.
Yes.
People will view it with suspicion and this is probably too ancient for us to even think about it. But the actual Bomoh that, especially during the colonial era, the version of Bomoh, they were well aware of those plants and those I would say natural ingredients to heal patient based on traditional methods, I suppose.
Yeah, so I would say it's actually the same now. So in a lot of RRC villages, you have bomos who are very well versed in traditional medicine, and well, quote unquote traditional. It's a loaded term, but it's a different form of medicine that is has a high level of efficacy, but is less understood. And so back then, Bolton wanted to learn from them, and he also found that he had things that he could share with them. So these conventions were ways of like meeting people, and also letting the bomos or the RRC know that if they needed help, it was just basically a call away. So they all of them had receivers, or they could just call the hospital whenever there was an issue, and then the helicopter would arrive in a couple of hours to pick up the sick person if the BOMO couldn't take care of them.
Can you give example of traditional healthcare that the BOMO introduced to Bolton?
So in terms of, it was more in terms of ideas of, for example, so I'm thinking more in terms of midwives currently, because so back then there were a lot of like midwives that were trained by Bolton as well, and one particular way of giving birth was instead of having the usual procedure of giving birth where you're lying face down, with orang asli you would normally sit in an upright position, so that so gravity would actually help with
the baby to come out from the womb.
So there was also a very communal effort. So whenever orang asli like fell sick, it was like something that the community was concerned with. And one thing that Bolton introduced, or that he learned from like these conventions and his interactions, was to introduce the idea of pengirings in Gombak. So whenever there was a patient who came to Gombak, they would be accompanied by family members and community members, and he had special dormitories, for example, for them to stay there, and also provisions for them. So this made the whole like healthcare system less foreign to them. While allowing like other people out there to, actually another point was that he could also treat other people in the community because of this, because the pengiring who came along, sometimes they themselves had some form of illness that they were not aware of, so he took the chance to actually just like treat them at the same time. So during this time, like we saw like quite a leap in terms of like orang asli being covered by medical health.
So we'll take one short break. When we return, we will talk about orang asli healthcare policy in today's Malaysia.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene, and we are back again on our discussion with Sern on the orang asli healthcare policy. Is it getting better or worse? So, in the past, you have figures like Bolton trying to marry traditional healthcare system or traditional healthcare values with the modern medicine and modern healthcare system. But in today's Malaysia, how has the orang asli adapted to the modern healthcare policy in this country?
So in terms of the orang asli, so there is quite a disjuncture. Up until recent years, there was quite a disjuncture in the healthcare services that were being provided and the orang asli themselves. So a lot of them were not really using healthcare anymore, and this was for various reasons. So partly because of logistical issues of like getting to the hospitals themselves, for lack of like proper roads and transportation. Another thing was also with the way that people who took over the running of like the healthcare system viewed the orang asli and their sense of entitlement. So I think this is a topic that I cover quite a lot in my thesis, where later on, after Bolton left in 1972, there was a very overt centralization of decision making.
Unlike in the past, during the colonial era.
During the colonial era and during Bolton's time, Bolton had a lot of say. He was very independent in his decision making, and this is also due to several factors, but mainly it was because he was the official medical officer, and he had the support of people within the government.
But the centralization of healthcare system in Malaysia is similar to any other forms of other areas of governmental rule, meaning that everything is more or less centralized in terms of education, in terms of even access to any kind of services. So the centralization of the Malaysian government, in fact, has jeopardized the independence or understanding the right kind of problem of the healthcare system in this country, especially affecting the Orang Asli people. Would that be the case?
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, that's pretty much the case. So centralization actually started in the 60s already, and it didn't really affect the Orang Asli in terms of healthcare until the 70s after Bolton left. So centralization efforts were channeled through the federal government, and the Department of Orang Asli Advancement, as it is known today, was also caught up in it, where decision making was very much top down, and information on the needs of Orang Asli were based on the perceptions of like some lower level bureaucrats, and feeding that up to like some of the higher level bureaucrats.
And there's very little empowerment and participation from the Orang Asli, I suppose, because in the past you have this concept of pengiring and also having Orang Asli medical officer, but after the centralization, do they still continue that kind of practice?
So one of the main things that occurred was there was a whole kind of there was a very pro-Malay policy of taking in more Malay employees within the healthcare system. So Orang Asli were seen as just not important anymore.
Or not qualified?
Or not qualified.
according to their own idea of
so a lot of them, so I think in was it in the early 2000s, so they introduced like hiring practices where you needed to have a certain level of education in order to be employed by the healthcare service, and pretty much none of the Orang Asli, or many of the Orang Asli, didn't have these qualifications.
Because during Bolton's era, he don't really emphasize on qualification, but more on assimilating the Orang Asli into the modern healthcare system.
Right. So I would say, so I wouldn't call it assimilation necessarily. I would call it more of a dialogue, or there was a great degree of empowerment and exchange. So assimilation is what happened later on. So as with many other Orang Asli policies out there, there was a very kind of overt effort to really assimilate the Orang Asli into the mainstream population.
I see. By excluding their own Orang Asli identity?
Yes, to the exclusion, or kind of how do I say this? To the exclusion and absorption of these identities. So the idea was that Orang Asli as a category should not exist within a couple of decades, and they should become part of the Bumiputra or Malay population.
So another area that you mentioned was about the lack of infrastructure in terms of roads, in terms of vehicle towards hospitals and clinics. So did the government not focusing a lot on in terms of getting the right kind of transportation, or modes of transportation from their villages towards the hospitals and other medical centers?
So a lot of the things that Bolton introduced in the 60s and 70s were still maintained after he left. But there was a lot of negligence in terms of how things were carried out. So, for example, if there was this case where there was a pregnant Orang Asli woman who went into labor, and because of like the standards that the Ministry of Health has, and also the Department of Orang Asli Affairs had on what is like safe child giving practices, she was taken out of the village several months before she gave birth, because it was deemed as unsanitary for her to stay in the village. But after she gave birth, there was no transportation to send her back for months, and she was cut off from her community for several months, where she couldn't interact with her. And this was in the early 2000s, so I'm talking more, this is before 2010. So you had things like that happening, and just a lot of inefficiency and uncertainty about what to do. And another thing that happened was also when the Orang Asli came to get healthcare, to receive healthcare in these in Gombak Hospital, for example, the administration at the hospital restricted their movement to the vicinity of the hospital, so they could not leave the hospital because they didn't want to put their careers on the line and say that, oh, I had one RRC patient running away or doing something else that shouldn't be done. So they tried to really control their movement to limit what they could do, which was very different from when during Bolton's time, where Bolton allowed them to just find their own food, to go out into the surrounding area or wherever they wanted, really, and made it as free as possible for them.
But why the lack of awareness in terms of the cultural of the culture of the Orang Asli in comparison to the Malay society? Because there seem to be a very feudalistic idea of they need to protect the Orang Asli from their own childish manner. In this case, they might run away from the hospital and they might not know what to do after that.
So that's a very complicated question as to why this happens, but it comes down to, I think, partly because of very long-held stereotypes from even the pre-British colonial era. So in the past you had like slave raiding amongst Orang Asli by the different sultanates. You also had and also ideas of like laziness, like who is the lazy native. So Sheikh Hussein Alatas actually talks a lot about this, like how the Malays are perceived as a lazy native, but in turn they perceive the Orang Asli as the lazy native. And this shifting of blame and shifting of like kind of less desirable qualities, inherent qualities, is partly to do with why there's a very common perception out there that the Orang Asli are just dumb, stupid, unhygienic, especially around ideas of like hygiene. It's always about like, oh, how unsanitary people are, and because of that we need to intervene to make their lives better.
So we'll take another short break. When we return, we will talk about a comparison between the Orang Asli Malaysia and the Aboriginal Australians.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene. You're with me and also Min Sern to talk about the Orang Asli healthcare policy, continuing our discussion today. So you also wrote in your master's paper about the Aboriginal Australians and compare it with the Orang Asli Malaysia in terms of the healthcare services and the healthcare system. What is the takeout on this both comparison?
So the takeaway with both of these countries is that despite like different political systems and socio-economic degrees of development within the two different countries, indigenous healthcare has turned out to be rather similar. So they have both ended up being rather assimilationist, rather like protectionist. So seeing the Orang Asli or Aboriginal Australians as quote-unquote wards of the state that need to be taken care of. And also the health disparities between the mainstream population and indigenous populations in both countries are quite low. It's quite wide. And so with some things that we do see is that, so for example, with the initial development of policies in both countries, there was a very strong sense of needing to protect the domestic security of those countries. So in the case of Malaysia, it was the emergency period and the communist insurgents. In the case of Australia, it was trying to populate an entire continent that was declared terra nullius, which means to say no man's land. So the Aboriginal Australians were not seen as really people up until the mid 20th century, and so the idea was that they introduced healthcare in order to shove them away from mainstream society, so that the rest of the society could develop however way they wanted to.
So are they actually better or worse off for the Aboriginal Australians?
So I think they're both more or less equally worse off. Maybe Aboriginal Australians are slightly better because they do have a lot more political representation, and they have so in terms of healthcare, they have a very specific form of community controlled healthcare, which is the Aboriginal community controlled health services, which are called ACCHSs. And so those came about in the 70s and are partly funded by the government, so they're not really non-profits, but they are actually bureaucratized organizations out there.
What are the Australians' general views towards the Aboriginal Australians?
So I would say,
is it the same of how the Malaysian the Malay or Malaysian would generally view the Orang Asli?
Yeah. So just to clarify a bit, so with views on Orang Asli in Malaysia, it's not just a view that is held by Malays, but it's more of a general Malaysian perception. And yes, I think the perception is quite similar. So there's this idea that they're just lazy, they're unhygienic, unsanitary, and not productive. So
there's this myth of lazy native flavor towards even towards the Australian Aborigines.
Yes, very much so. That they are just not not pulling their weight in society to develop the country.
But why why the lack of understanding about the lifestyle and the cultural differences between the modern civilization or the modern population and the Orang Asli population, which is very much I would say very much different from the way society would view life supposed to be.
So I think again it's quite complicated, but I would say that it's mainly to do with what society values as important in terms of achievement or non-achievement. So we have a society which is very much very very Western oriented. So we're all about the Western notions of what a good life means. So having our high level education, being able to buy the goods that we want, be it branded or not. So those kind of consumeristic attitudes are what we think are important, and because the Orang Asli and Aboriginal Australians don't partake in this as much, they are seen as being very traditional and backward. And there's a very constant narrative that indigenous peoples have not advanced at all for thousands of years, which is something that is quite ridiculous, because people are not stagnant. There is a development of knowledge, and there is change within these societies as well. Just that to us it's not as visible, because the way they communicate it is not in the form of numbers or this is my revenue, this is how much we've gained, how much growth we've gotten, but it's about in this past few months we've discovered several different cures to new illnesses in some form of plant material out there in the jungles, and those are the kind of things that people realize, but they're not easily quantifiable, and because of that.
What are other misconceptions that the Malaysian public would have towards the Orang Asli in Malaysia?
So other misconceptions. So I think another misconception would be that people tend to think, one thing is that people always tend to confuse the Orang Asli with the Orang Asal in Malaysia.
Actually, I'm confused myself, because I don't know how to differentiate between both.
So when you talk about, Orang Asli is a term that's only used specifically for the 18 subgroups of indigenous peoples in Peninsular Malaysia, and in Sabah Sarawak they're completely different, as I mentioned before. And the overarching term that's used to describe these indigenous peoples is Orang Asal. And so Orang Asli is a term that was started in the early 60s as a way to move beyond the whole Aborigines / Sakai way of calling them, which was derogatory to a great extent.
So when it comes to special rights in the Constitution, does it cover Orang Asli's rights as well?
So yes and no. And that's where it gets a bit interesting, because technically the Orang Asli are considered to be Bumiputra, but in the Constitution, when one looks at the wording, the Orang Asli are not explicitly mentioned as being part of the Bumiputra population. So it talks about the Malays, and then it talks about the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak. But this is because, in the past at least, different censuses have had different ways of categorizing the Orang Asli. So some of them saw the Orang Asli as basically just Malay people, another subgroup of Malays, but some didn't. And during the time when the whole conception of the idea of Bumiputra came about, they were seen as a part of the Malay group. But that is also problematic because of our definition of what is Malay, which doesn't jive with Orang Asli beliefs, for example, because not all are Muslim, some are Christian, some are animistic or believe in different kind of spiritual ways of being. So
their lifestyle and their belief system actually makes it complicated in terms of whether they should be Bumiputra or not, according to how Malaysia would see Bumiputra supposed to be.
Yes, that, and also just culturally speaking, and even when you look at the historical relationship between Orang Asli and Malays was very distinct.
Does this affect the Orang Asli healthcare policy in any way, either explicitly or subtly?
So I think,
especially with the NEP.
So at least with the NEP, I don't think it really affected the Orang Asli at all. I mean, I haven't looked into it in detail, but I don't think it really affected them because it didn't really cover healthcare. And the Orang Asli are, normally when one talks about Bumiputra people, we talk about specifically Malays, not really about the other Bumiputra groups out there. So the Orang Asli were pretty much left out, and during this time there was when NEP was being put in place up until 1990, there were a lot of Islamicization efforts being carried out on the Orang Asli.
So special privilege were being given to Orang Asli that want to convert to Islam. Would that be the case?
It's hard to say to what extent they received some special treatment, but one can assume that yes, they probably did get more special treatment. But yeah, there was both systematic and less systematic ways of converting the Orang Asli, which happened up until I think 2008, 2009. We still you have there were charamas in Gombak Hospital, that kind of thing. But much of it was much more on an ad hoc individual basis, where some individuals within the bureaucracy saw it as their role to convert the Orang Asli.
So we will take another short break. When we return, we will talk about the way forward at addressing the challenges and limitation of the healthcare policy for the Orang Asli.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas, critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
This is Arlene again, and we are back with Sern to discuss about the Orang Asli healthcare policy. So the way forward, you mentioned a lot of different issues that Orang Asli are facing in terms of infrastructure, access to healthcare, and in terms of the way the bureaucrats viewed the Orang Asli in Malaysia, and I think as well as the misconception the general public have towards the Orang Asli and the lack of rights of Orang Asli in terms of accessing to basic needs, even though they technically are considered the original people of Malaysia, the term Orang Asli. So how can we address this in a more structural form if we were to see this, we were to address the Orang Asli healthcare issue in a more systematic way?
So a more systematic way of dealing with Orang Asli health would be to really involve Orang Asli in the entire decision-making process and also the implementation of healthcare services. Namely, so during Bolton's time there was a lot of involvement in terms of the implementation aspects of the latter, but I think it's also quite important to involve people, Orang Asli in trying to understand what their conception of good health means first of all, and to move towards that direction as the ideal, and to shape policies around that, rather than saying that our conception of good health is like the lack of certain diseases, and in order to do that we just need to keep on introducing new vaccines or new forms of medication that are forced upon the Orang Asli.
So besides empowering Orang Asli and include them in the decision making process, what are other means that at least the public or Malaysian government can do to reduce the kind of misconception that people have towards them?
So in terms of more broadly speaking of misconception, I think definitely this is something that can be quite hard to achieve, but yes, greater awareness of just who the Orang Asli are, and just within the historical narrative of Malaysia, just really talk about them. So, for example, when we study, when we read about the communist insurgency or the emergency period in the 1950s, we talk about the new Chinese villages and BRICS plan. What is not talked about is the fact that the Orang Asli were also
they have their own village.
There was the BRICS plan was carried out on them, and estimates run up to 7,000 Orang Asli died during that time because of the conditions of the very ad hoc villages that was being set up, and this was all done for the sake of quote unquote their security or safety, but it ended up just killing a lot of the Orang Asli, and they were also.
That means there's very little narratives from the Orang Asli side when it comes to the kind of issues that they face. Even, when it comes to all Malaysian history, it's always the narrative from the Malay, Chinese and Indian.
Yeah, and we thinking back into that period as well, a main part of the reason why the British colonial government could win against the conflict with the communist insurgents was because of the information and the intel they gathered from the Orang Asli and having the Orang Asli on the side. In fact, that was the most important piece in the entire conflict. Like, whoever could win the hearts of the Orang Asli would win the war, or the quote unquote the civil conflict. So yeah. But we don't talk about that in textbooks. No one really knows about this, but this is actually well documented, and we know for a fact that this was the case.
Yeah, in fact, I think I saw in one of the British documentary about the communists in Malaya, how they win over the war. I saw it in YouTube. That's how I got to know how the Orang Asli has contributed tremendously in terms of trying to win the ideological war between the leftists and also the Malaysian government at that time. In terms of Orang Asli healthcare, is there a way forward, at least for the immediate action plan for Orang Asli to get better healthcare in this country?
So I think the most basic things we can do right now is to implement the kind of things that Bolton did back in the 60s. So to really hire Orang Asli medical orderlies as part of the system, and to have greater communication between villages. So having people in the villages who are midwives or bomos knowing what's available outside, and also having the formal healthcare system knowing more about what's available in the villages, and having a lot of communication between the two, so that you both can support each other in providing the best possible healthcare for the Orang Asli. So I think that's something the infrastructure is there and it can be done, but there is maybe a certain reluctance to really establish that yet, although that is changing currently from what I gather. So I think well, with Orang Asli healthcare and Aboriginal Australian healthcare, I think one interesting thing is that there are a lot of similarities between the two, and it's interesting that despite the fact that they have different systems, that this has turned out to be the case. So one thing we can learn more is to really look at countries out there who are really empowering their indigenous peoples and really giving value to. I
think Latin American countries would be one of the best examples.
So putting value into the different ways of living that people have. So Latin America, so in Ecuador and Bolivia, there are very strong movements currently, and also not even looking that far, just looking at New Zealand to Canada with the First Nations to the Suomi or Finland. There are very strong efforts being put in place to really put worth into indigenous ways of knowing and living, and I think that's very important, and that's something that needs to happen in Malaysia, just broadly speaking, not just in healthcare but with Orang Asli and in other indigenous populations.
So with that, thank you very much, Min Sern.